So let us begin the perspectives for today. The first article is about seeking equality across faiths. See, as we know, there was a Sabrimala judgment on temple entry rights to women. So Sabrimala judgment had led to clashes between the faithful and the Kerala state administration when the latter tried to enforce the rule of law. So this always happens, clash of faiths. So many Muslim women's groups, when the Hindu women were allowed to temple, it so happened that many Muslim women groups also, encouraged by the verdict, they had sought to push their case for entry into mosques to pray alongside men. So it's not only restricted to one faith; it is equality across faiths. It's not only applicable to Hindu women, but this line of thought should be applicable to both Muslim women, Christian, and other sects also. For example, the issue of female genital mutilation among the Dawoodi Bohras has often come up for discussion. So this is a very regressive practice being done in Dawoodi Bohras, and there is a pushback from the powerful clergymen. This has meant that the faith has triumphed over gender. So there is a, if we have to weigh the issues, it is faith at one side, and there's the issue of gender rights. So faith versus gender rights. This is the uh, values at play here, and also the principle of gender equality we know has been enshrined in the constitution. So principle under Article 14, we can say, for example, in a secular, and we are a secular country, constitutional democracy such as India. So where faith is important, we know that faith is definitely important. It also has its own place. If the faith is discriminatory, if faith becomes discriminatory, then it has to be subjected to the rule of law. So this is the line of thought when it comes to faith versus gender rights. We can take this position that faith is fine, but if it becomes discriminatory, then it must bow down to the rule of law, especially when we are operating in a constitutional democracy such as today. So this is one issue where we have to take a firm position on faith and gender rights and promoting equality across faiths. So moving forward, uh, it's about child labor, very important issue from the vulnerable section point of view, GS2. So we know that poverty, inequality, and social discrimination and lack of access to schooling in the current COVID context have always been the driving force for perpetuating child labor. So these are sometimes the core reasons why child labor exists in India. For example, the poverty, children are forced to enter into the labor force because of poverty, and then inequality in the society, and also social discrimination. It's not allowing children to enter schools, social discrimination, and a lack of access to schooling. So the lack of access to schooling have always been driving forces in the perpetuation of child labor. So this point I'm sorry to remember. And then the ILO and UNICEF, no, along with child labor, there are other ills. There are certain allied social evils such as child marriage, such as child trafficking, which happens. So the International Labour Organization and UNICEF uh, are working towards these targets. And then Center had released the data regarding such challenges plaguing children in 409 districts. So Center had released some data on this 409 districts. It laid out guidelines for action under the heads such as survival. First is survival, then is of course education. First survival, then education, development. Then you have to protect the vulnerable sections and also make them inclusive, make them participate. So these are the heads under which we must see the issue of child overall development, child survival, child education, child development, child protection, and child participation. And then the irony is that very stark in India, that India has the highest number of laws. Like, we have plethora of laws for every issue. For corruption, we have higher, more number of laws, but still corruption exists. For home safety, we have laws, but still, we have one of the most stringent laws, but still heinous crimes keep on happening. So this is the irony that India has the highest number of laws against child labor in the world, but it also has the highest number of minor child laborers. So this is the irony with respect to the Indian context, and there are certain flaws in the law. So one famous example which you can give for flaw in child labor law is that the Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Amendment Act prohibits children under 18 from being employed in hazardous occupations. So although it prohibits children under 18 from hazardous employment, they are allowed in they're allowed to work in family enterprises. This is the exception they've given. So this exception can obviously be misused, but because family enterprise, all these things are very, become very vague, and they can always tell that these are family enterprises, extended family, and such things. So such loopholes allow children, especially those from the vulnerable, poor families, as we saw, poverty is one of the causes. They get trapped in the intergenerational debt bondage. So there is intergenerational debt, which has been thrown upon such vulnerable sections, and they continue, they're deprived of education to slip through the cracks. So this is the biggest reason. And closure of schools and the advent of online classes, there's closure of schools and the advent of online classes. This has put an education beyond their reach, because schools were one avenue where they could go, at least they could get a nutrition, health, security needs, hunger, those aspects were, no, were met. But now, because of closure of schools and coupled with online classes, these sections are vulnerable, and they lack access to affordable smartphones, internet, electricity, all such things have put education beyond the reach of children with little or no access to internet or even digital gadgets. So pandemic has, exacerbated their problems. The problem is layered. As we see, its problem is very layered and needs multiple interventions at multiple levels. Campaigns against child labor, we know famous Nobel laureates such as Kailash Satyarthi working towards this goal against child labor and early marriage. Child labor, child marriage, child trafficking, all these go hand in hand. Early marriage must be accompanied by realization of universal education. So, the child labor, the aspect of universal education, as well as economic security for the underprivileged, like for example, poverty, income security, social security. So these things have to be done together to address the problem of child labor in the country. So very important article on child labor from the Indian context. Moving forward, as we've discussed that there's a differential rate of population growth in the country, and north south divide exists because of this. So again, Madras High Court opinion comes up. So family planning has been effectively uh, done in southern states, and this has reduced, family planning has effectively reduced the share of southern states in Lok Sabha. So the Madras High Court said last week that Tamil Nadu should be compensated for loss of two Lok Sabha seats on account of its successful family planning program. So regular delimitation, what happens is when regular delimitation is done, it rectifies the misrepresentation or a mal appropriation of on account of population growth and migration. So population growth and migration are dynamic forces, which are, especially migration is a dynamic force which is operating. So the population growth is uneven in states, as we know, because of the varying different total fertility rate, different socio-economic conditions, and just and the just representation of classes and castes is nearly impossible. It is obvious that there cannot be a just representation, as told by the political scientist Alistair Macmillan, who wrote a decisive book on electoral representation in India, will have us believe that India, had India delimitation be done, okay, on the basis of 2001 census, Tamil Nadu would have lost seven more Lok Sabha seats, while Uttar Pradesh would have gained seven. So this is the kind of argument where political power, some states might lose and some states might gain if delimitation is done. It is a politically sensitive issue. And then if one were to use the 2011 census, then southern states overall would stand to lose 17 seats. And we all know that Atal Bihari Vajpayee lost the no confidence by only one seat. So that is the value of even single seat in Lok Sabha. Southern states would stand to lose 17 seats, while Bihar, MP, and UP and Rajasthan would gain 22 seats. So this is the how numbers, why numbers matter in this context of population delimitation, has to be looked in this context. So moving forward, taking the sting out of love jihad law. So as we see that many states have enacted the anti-conversion love jihad law. So in this context, Gujarat High Court had passed a important judgment. So Gujarat High Court's order, it has stayed some sections of the new anti-love jihad law. So the issue is about anti-conversion, hitting the fundamental rights. So amendment which in effect, this amendment, which in effect treated an interfaith marriage, it may be any faith, interfaith marriage, as involving forced religious conversions, and thus a criminal offense. So the act assumed that if there is an interfaith marriage, if the marriage is happening between Muslim and Hindu, the act assumed that it is a forced religious conversion. But On the contrary, it might also be that the couples have voluntarily also married, because intercaste marriage and interfaith marriage, can be, is being accepted, and it is right. It is part of person's right to choose as per fundamental right, and Supreme Court has declared it under Article 21 also. So this fact that interfaith marriage might also be a person's out of person's choice is what aspect needs to be looked into. This pressure on intended couple, so this will create pressure on intending couple to refrain the marriage, because if that treats their marriage as something forceful, and they'll be forced to separate. And in such situations, interfaith marriage becomes impossible. The court also noted that the government tried to shift the burden of proof on the accused under this act. Marriage is a matter of personal choice. So now comes the aspect of marriage, society. So societal topic: marriage is a matter of personal choice for anyone. So marriage should be religion. So especially in this context of interfaith, religion should not be a barrier for love and marriage, because these are eternal things, one's a personal choice. So laws that constrain interfaith marriage. So in this context, the anti-love jihad law, which is enacted by many states, that constrain the interfaith marriages, do not respect the personal freedoms guaranteed by constitution. So our constitution not only guarantees a personal freedom, it also grants a person to freely convert to whichever faith or thing. So that is an Article 25 of his choice. So it also protects the freedom, it also protects, so it's very positive in connotation. So laws that constrain interfaith marriages do not respect the personal freedoms guaranteed by the constitution. This is the limitation of such laws. The government should actually be encouraging. So we are a diverse country, we take pride in saying unity in diversity. So government should actually be encouraging interfaith marriages and intercaste marriages also, to promote the spirit of tolerance and inclusiveness in society. So in this is but in some cases governments tend to do the reverse, example anti-jihad laws or anti-conversion laws, which does the opposite. It restricts the interfaith marriages and intercaste marriages. So this is the line of thought which we can take, that government should actually be encouraging interfaith and intercaste marriages to promote the spirit of tolerance and inclusiveness in the society. So it's a very important perspective on anti-faith, religion, marriage, such things in the society. So moving forward is about idea of social justice. As we know, social justice is a direct head. So what should be the idea of social justice? This is particularly pertinent when it comes to the current demand for caste census in the country. So a new caste census will change the political landscape, intercommunity equations, reservation policy, the welfare architecture, and electoral outcomes. So um, this is what a new caste census would do. Like similarly, what the Mandal report or Mandal Commission report did back then. So a new caste census today, it will change the political landscape in the country. It might even lead to the emergence of newer caste-based political parties. It will change the power of regional political parties. New caste-based political parties can emerge. Intercommunity equation. Some communities might lose. Some communities might gain. The reservation policy might get affected. Varying proportions. Welfare architecture overall, reservation in terms of education, employment, and also the electoral outcomes. Because in India, caste is also a determinant of the voting behavior in the country. So, caste-based count on India's population, the caste-based count of India's population has troubling premise and potentially disturbing consequences. But some people feel that it is inevitable now. Inevitable now. The core question is what constitutes the collective imagination of India and what defines social justice. So, what is India? How do we like to see India collectively? And what defines social justice? So, caste remains a key determinant of political choice even today. So, caste is a reality in India. It's a key determinant of political choice. Socioeconomic status is also determined by caste to some extent, and even the access of opportunities. As we saw, social discrimination also perpetuates child labor earlier. So caste, in a way, is a key determinant even today of political choice, socioeconomic status, access to opportunities. So designing policies or even conducting politics based on 1931 census, which old one, is irrational. So that will not be rational today if we keep doing policies and politics based on the old data. The caste census, prelude to enhanced reservation. Ultimately, it will lead to more reservations. It's a tool to address the historical injustice, because that is the purpose of giving reservation in the first place. It's a tool for employment generation. It's a tool for employment generation. It's a tool for power sharing. Right, we are sharing power with other backward communities and addressing manufactured grievances. So this is why caste census is so pertinent: reservation, historical injustice, employment generation, power sharing, political power, addressing manufactured grievances. Census will also deepen political competition within group identity. So there will be in-group competition which can take place within the group, that is both caste, and to circumvent caste, what will happen? They'll religion will prevail over individual rights. So this is the aspect which has to be taken into account. So imagination of India, where individual is seen as little else but as a member of his caste. So when we try to see India, how we would like to see collective imagination of India? Would we like to see India or an individual as a narrow identity from his caste? Should caste be an identity, a marker of one's identity? So, or ignoring the real questions such as opportunities, shrinking opportunities across castes. So this is a reality. This is a real question. The real question is not about which caste, which identity. The real question is shrinking opportunity. What can be done to increase the opportunity, or what can be done to raise the demographic dividend of the country, wherein once opportunities are reached to every section, automatically the call for reservation would come down. If we create employment, if we create prosperity for all. So that should be the real question of shrinking opportunities, be in public or be in the private. As we know that jobless growth is attached to India. So there must be better ways to ensure justice, provide equity, and democratize power. So there must be better ways to ensure justice, not just by caste census, but must be better ways beyond this caste census to provide justice, provide equity, democratize power, rather than reinforcing the old caste identities. Uh, Instead of annihilating the caste, as mentioned by Ambedkar. So this is the aspect of caste census again, where how do we want to see caste census in today's context and idea of social justice. So moving forward again, Afghanistan issue is a burning issue and keeps articles keep coming every day. So now we must have a national consensus on Afghanistan. So events in Afghanistan represent a serious national security threat. So what's happening in our neighborhood will affect. It will obviously create instability or has a potential to create instability in our country. The rise of Taliban threatens to become an issue in Indian domestic politics. We must also first secure citizens as well as interests and investment that the country we have made over the 2 decades, 3 billion worth of investment, both in physical, social infrastructure, parliament being a symbol of democracy. Experience of early 1980s when the jihadi fighters moved to Kashmir from Afghanistan, and the same thing, religious extremism spread, and we could see a rise in insurgencies in Kashmir. So that should be a reminder in our mind. So we need a national consensus on how to approach the issue of Afghanistan. So it's a potential national security threat. And then there's issues about sports culture in the country. So one key dimension which we must always keep in mind is the issue of tapping the grassroots talent. So that is why programs such as Catch Them Young becomes very important. Catching the talent at the very young age, giving the proper training and the professional coaches with a single-minded devotion. So this is a very crucial thing to be done, especially to promote sports culture, promote excellence from the early age. So this is pertinent. So next is about education. So we must education again linking to the larger theme of child labor only. So India must go all out to restore education. So this is a crucial thing because schools have been closed. We can see issues of child labor, hunger, malnutrition. So that's why we must restore education. So online ecosystem has problems of digital divide. There are some haves and have-nots. Children are hitting the labor market. Access to midday meals is being deprived. So, but India must go all out to restore education. Schooling in India is not only about education; it's about an equalizer. Schooling is a vital investment that fuels economic growth and social regeneration. So, schooling has a larger purpose in a developing country like India, where it is seen as an equalizer to many of the social evils plaguing the society. It is a key tool for empowerment. So, moving on, this is the palm oil context. So, India barely produces just 1.5% of its palm oil, while we import around 9 million tons from Southeast Asian countries, mainly Indonesia and Malaysia, particularly. So, India is one of the largest vegetable oil consumers, but we are heavily import dependent. So import dependence, what it does, it also makes us vulnerable to price fluctuations, food inflation. So, National Mission of Edible Oil and Oil Palms also looks to secure farmers' interest. In this context, there is an aspect of farmers' interest, doubling farmers' income, its price regulation as well as viability price mechanisms given the long gestation period of the crop. So, generally, for the palm oil to yield the returns, it will take around 5 years. So, it has a long gestation period. So, farmers who are into this should be provided certain viability price mechanism to deal with such long gestation period crops. And there's also a health concern associated with palm oil or any oil for that matter, because as we are the largest consumer, we are also happen to be the diabetic capital of the world. Center must not ignore the traditional oil seeds. So palm oil should not replace the traditional oil seeds that can address the edible oil security in that context. And then we have the climate impact also playing. IPCC report has come up. There's a climate change impact happening. So many of the water guzzling. So, we must know that it is water guzzling in nature, right? Palm oil is very water guzzling in nature, and it has no serious impacts on the biodiversity. For example, it is proposed to be cultivated in northeast and Andaman, which are traditionally biodiversity hotspots, and with special focus on northeast and Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which are the two eco-sensitive regions. So we must ensure that environmental safeguards are in place and health interests are not compromised. So this is about the palm oil perspective. Again, a dimension on the palm oil. So moving forward, this is an important article from the oceanography perspective also, because the ocean science for sustainable development. This is a decade of ocean science for sustainable development, a decade programmed by United Nations. They have declared this. So if you see, so ocean science for sustainable development, the program for a decadal development program. But as we observe, oceans are beneficial for mankind for multiple reasons. Ocean resources, as we call them resources. So it provides us food, maybe fishes or multiple various type of fishes which are essential for nutritional security. They also help in promoting trade and commerce, navigation, critical sea lanes of navigation, waterways across the globe. Exploitation of ocean resources, sea resources. For example, India has been given exclusive right to mine the polymetallic nodules in Indian Ocean. Accidental oil spills, such negative incidents, oil spills can impact the seafood. They can has a potential to make seafood unsafe to eat. Oil spills, and they can harm the entire marine ecosystem. Those responsible for oil spills can be held responsible to pay up for the cleanup and restoration. It's very important to restore the ecosystem in its pristine condition. So in India, there is the Oil Pollution Act of 1919. The process of assessing the impact of spill and reaching a settlement to fund restoration projects is called Natural Resource Damage Assessment. So the decade, which is this decade, 2021 to 30, decade of ocean science for sustainable development, it will be held from this decade. So six main expected societal outcomes we can see by such oral programs. So broad societal outcomes here are: we must have a clean ocean first, and oceans must be healthy and resilient, and a protected ocean should be there. It must be safe and clean, as discussed, safe, a sustainably harvested and productive ocean. Whatever resources we expect from the ocean must be sustainable, in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, and a transparent and accessible ocean. So these are the main six expected outcomes. The South Pacific region is the largest ocean space in the world. As we know, Pacific is the largest ocean. South Pacific is the largest ocean space in the world. It is home to variety of ecosystems. When we talk about ocean, we talk about ecosystems such as atolls, coral reefs, called the rainforest of the oceans, mangroves along the tidal range, covering almost one third of the Earth. So when we see oceans broadly cover 71% of the planet's surface, 91% being land. So they feed us, right? They feed us with all we discuss. They protect us, also protect us from various impacts, and absorb. See, in the climate change context, also oceans are the main absorber. They're the main heat sinks. They absorb more than 90% of the excess heat generated by global warming. So in that context, in the context of global warming, also oceans play an important role. They absorb 90% of the excess heat generated by warming. So ocean research, but if you see overall the ocean research as a challenge or potential lacuna, Ocean research remains poorly funded. It receives only a tiny fraction, an average of less than 2% of the national research budget. So there's a need to promote more ocean research so that oceans can be preserved in the natural condition, because most of the land-based ecosystems humans have degraded. For example, be it the forest deforestation, land degradation, water also we have problems of pollution. So ocean is one such ecosystem which needs to be preserved, highlighting the problem of land resource degradation. So an important article from oceanography perspective. So moving forward, this no article is, as we know, there is a growing divide in the development paradigm, wherein the state capitals tend to be more developed compared to the other parts. State capitals act as engines of growth, and they also act as growth poles. Primate city concept, as we know, development today is concentrating fully on state capitals in that sense, which is creating some whole lot of migration which is unsustainable, leading to leading to haphazard urban development. So new development mode where we need a development mode in this situation where tier 2 cities are favored. Tier 2 cities are favored by entrepreneurs to set up units. Why tier 2 cities need preferred? Because these cities have relatively lower cost and for land and other infrastructural requirements. So because of such considerations, the tier 2 cities need to be developed further, and this will help in counter urbanization, reducing the pressure on tier 1 cities, and it will change the new model. So the smart cities mission of the government is intended in this action where 100 smart cities were planned. So this will disperse the growth along other cities. So moving on, again as we discussed from palm oil. So palm oil concern not only with respect to the forest but also soil, because it whatever we do it upsets the soil balance, natural balance of the soil. And also monoculture we know is antithetical to biodiversity. When we cultivate one crop, uh, it will destroy the biodiversity of the region. Like for example, when we cultivated rice and wheat in the green revolution belt, we have today come to a situation where groundwaters have reached unsustainable levels. There is problem of soil salinization, land degradation, desertification issues. Also we can see how the farmer protest is also linked to all these things. Monoculture is very deleterious to biodiversity. So monoculture is antithetical to biodiversity. Some plant species in one field area, some plant species in one field area rob the soil of its nutrients. So soil of the nutrients is robbed by the plant species. It results in decreasing varieties of bacteria and microorganisms needed to maintain soil fertility. So soil fertility is disturbed because of such monoculture. Decreasing varieties have. So we must also, this is a key dimension of soil fertility. So important perspective from biogeography and environmental geography point of view. So nothing much. This was again this is article which continues with respect to the palm oil thing. So National Mission on uh, Edible Oils and Oil Palm. There's some apprehensions about this. So first, as we know, some basic facts is it aims to expand the area under cultivation of palm oil fruits by an additional 6.5 lakh hectares, 3 lakh hectares to around 10. So overall, it becomes 10 lakh hectares by 2025-26. So overall, as we see from the international perspective, a balance of international trade of community, as India is a largely import dependent. We are largely import dependent on palm oil. So has a potential to be damaging to ecology, as we discussed. One component is soil. We already discussed monoculture and thing. Biodiversity we discussed, forest ecosystem hotspots. So criticized by experts because edible oil crops like mustard and soybean, and see, palm oil is a tree crop. A tree crop in the sense, what happens is how it is different from other oil seeds. Palm oil, it's a tree crop. When you compare it to mustard and soybean, this is a tree crop. Palm oil is a tree crop, and this crop stands for an average of 30 years. uh, is what we can say as an average tree crop rate. It stands for an average of 30 years. For example, in 30 years, we can see that first 3 years are juvenile period, 1 to 3 years juvenile period, 4 to 8 years is a stabilizing period, and then 9 to 30 years is a stabilized period. So extraction of oil, as we discussed, starts from the fifth. first extraction starts from the fifth year. So that's why we discussed there's a long gestation period for palm oil, and it's very cheap price and high acceptability internationally. Also, the palm oil requires more water. It's water guzzling. This is the problem in the Indian context. It's very water guzzling. We are a water stressed country, and tropical forests are very lucrative because they act as climate sinks, heat sinks, biodiversity hotspots like Andaman and Nicobar. So Supreme Court has stopped, in 2001 itself, it has stopped monocropping in Andaman and Nicobar, and it had banned exotic species. Once cultivated, the trees will have to live for decades. As we saw, 30 years it has to live. It will be water guzzling in that nature, and this will keep biodiversity above profit. That is the concern. Whether we have to keep biodiversity above profit in a time where climate change concerns are there. This is the concern that have been raised. Next is about